Right, the top of the screen says it's now live, so
Yes.
presumably we can now start. Have we got any apologies or substitutions?
Yes, we have apologies from Marion Budd, from Northolt High, from Roisin Walsh, from Dormers Wells, from Aruna Sharma from Villiers, and from Lindsay Lee from Maples Nursery and Children's Centre.
Has anyone brought anyone else's apologies? No, and there are no substitutions?
No, not as far as I'm aware, no.
Well, good evening, everybody. Let's get on with the main business. There aren't any urgent matters that I'm aware of. Nothing has come since dispatch. I don't think anything we're talking about has to be considered in private. Matters to be considered, declarations of interest. Has anyone got any interest, financial interest in the discussion tonight?
Nope.
No. Let's move to the minutes. Can I ask if they are a correct record of the meeting on the 12th of January? Has anyone any amendments to propose?
No amendments, thanks, Margaret.
Okay. In that case, I'll take it that they are a correct record, unless anyone disagrees, and I'll sign them eventually.
No, not for me.
Membership, I don't think there's been any change since last time we met, has there?
No, there hasn't.
No. And then we go to the main business, which is the school funding report. And is it Judith or Tamara who's going to introduce it?
Thanks, Margaret. It'll be Tamara.
Thanks, Margaret. Evening, everybody. So at the April meeting of the forum, the main item of business is agreeing the scheme for financing maintained schools and schools in Ealing. We've set out the scheme and the main changes to the scheme, and then we'll be noting that any further amendments following feedback from the forum tonight will be considered and then represented at the next meeting of the forum. So Kim is just going to take us through that item.
Hi everyone. Okay, so as Tamara said, the this part of the report is basically to seek approval from the Schools Forum for the Scheme for Financing Schools 21-22. The scheme is the authority's financial framework governing financial matters in relation to maintained primary, secondary and special schools. And the reason for decision are that the local authority published the scheme on an annual basis and are required to seek the forum's approval before making revisions for the scheme. So we bring it to the report to the April meeting with changes effective from the 1st of April, so sort of the scheme from 1st of April 2021. The 2021-22 version, the draft version, is attached to the report's Appendix 1. So the scheme is substantially the same as the one approved for 2021, but updated to reflect policy and legislation changes through the DfE directed revisions. So there's two sort of directed revisions for this year's report. The first one is set out in 4.3 of the report, and it's the requirement for schools to submit a 3-year budget forecast. So the wording has been added into the report as per the DfE guidance that a school should submit a 3-year budget from the 2021-22 funding year. Each school must submit a 3-year budget forecast each year. And the deadline for submitting that this year, the deadline would normally be the first Friday in May, the same as the sort of the 1-year budget plan. But this year that's been extended to the 21st of May due to COVID. So that's set out in the report as well. And the second directed change is the requirement to submit a recovery plan to the local authority where a school's revenue deficit rises above 5% as at 31st of March of any year. So that's set out in 6.5 of the report. The changes are detailed further in Appendix 2, but that's substantially the two changes. The updated scheme maintains the balance control mechanism for excess surplus balances, but that's the decision around that is not something that we bring to the April meeting. It's something that we will revert to Forum in the June meeting following the confirmation of the maintained school balances to make a decision about whether to implement the mechanism this year. Once approved, the scheme will be published on the Ealing Grid for Learning at the website address set out in the report.
Thank you. Are schools getting on with their 3-year budget forecast, or are they needing some help with it? I mean, has the authority had requests for help?
Yeah, so the LA provides a traded service, and a large number of schools, about 60 odd schools, buy into that out of the 19 schools in Ealing. So they're supported through that service.
If I can,
Sorry.
Ian, was it?
yeah, I've got a couple of things really. Was that I was going to say, representing Spring Hallow, I can say we have already made good progress on that. I know that Pam, our business manager, has done so. I've had a couple of other questions, Kim, if I might go back on the 2 points. I mean, the first, because there's been some discussion about the 3-year plan, what do we expect to actually be done with that 3-year plan? I have years of experience in the corporate world of knowing how effective question mark 3-year and 5-year plans are, but I was just wondering what the government's expectation was, or the local authority's expectation. And secondly, on the other point, how many schools are expected to need to do the deficit planning deficit thing that you referred to? Is it a small number or is it a sizable number?
So on what the local authority will do with those 3-year plans. So the scheme sets out that the local authority sort of can use those 3-year plans as evidence to support their assessment of schools' financial value standards, and or use them in support of the authority's balance control mechanisms. So yeah, the local authority will review those plans. The other thing is in support of schools. So while some schools, while they might not be in deficit at the moment, if their 3-year plan shows that they're moving towards it, or they think they're moving towards a deficit position, we'd be using those sort of figures in that plan to then sort of support and work with schools on their plans around that position. Tamara, I don't know if you want to come in further on that or on the second point.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's really for kind of monitoring purposes, and if nothing else, it's to ensure that schools understand that the 3-year plan is a requirement, and that school leaders and their governing bodies understand the school's position and are taking action where required, whether that be, you know, ensuring that they're spending the budget that's been allocated to the children when they're attending, so not racking up excess balances, or making sure that there's proactive plans in place to avoid deficits and, you know, where possible, avoid kind of avoidable redundancy processes. So, you know, not recruiting people that then need to make redundant further down the line. So I'd say schools in Ealing, we've been asking for 3-year plans from schools for a number of years before it's become a DFE requirement. I think our schools are, you know, school leaders and business managers are, you know, quite experienced in delivering that. There are some areas where, you know, schools come to us early with concerns and we offer support at that stage. So that part's not, you know, part of a traded service. Schools come to Kim and I, and we've had a number of meetings with schools recently where they're either concerned about their budget this year or they're concerned about budget in future years. And then there are proactive conversations about what action schools might take and what support the LA might be able to offer.
I got the impression that the guidance for the income profile going forward for 3 years and the guidance for the potential cost growth, even if you didn't do anything extravagant, was meaning almost certainly that you were going to diverge and have a problem with year 3, and probably in particular. I know that's true in the school that I'm associated with, and I'm sure I'm not alone there, because there's a limit to how much cutting can be done, and a lot of it needs to be built into what income a school can expect to receive, because costs are going to keep going up no matter what, I suspect. I was just wondering if there'd been any early guidance on how the government might react to funding to cover cost builds over the next 3 years as a result of this 3-year planning process.
Sure. So I think the government's broadly cited on some of the financial challenges in schools because they've been managing, ultimately they're responsible for the academies. They do put inflationary increases within the school's funding formula, and this year they rolled in the teachers' pay and pension grants. It's clear that that doesn't fund the full cost, and schools are, essentially expected to make efficiencies where they can. I think schools have broadly been reasonably well funded, and that's been, we've seen the large balances that schools, that large number of schools have had in Ealing, and those opportunities to kind of, salami slice are reducing. So I think there are going to be more substantial changes, and we're seeing that particularly this year when that is kind of colliding with reductions in pupil numbers, particularly in the primary sector. I'd say for a number of schools, pupil numbers is having more of an impact than inflationary increases or pay and pensions increases quite often, and that, largely in the primary sector, but in the medium term that will be an impact on some of our high school sector as well.
David, your hand was first.
Yes, thank you very much, Margaret. Appreciate that. Yes, I mean, it's extremely difficult, obviously, to do a 3-year budget when we really don't know what the settlements will be. And we've seen changes this year that the Chancellor's made at the last minute. So it's going to be extremely difficult. However, I have to say, I think it's a really useful exercise forcing schools to do this. I can only speak from my own experience in the school where I'm actually acting chair of governors at the moment. I'm responsible for resources. I mean, it has really made us really look carefully into the future and frankly, consider some quite tough decisions, which has been really helpful. But in the longer term, it's really hard to judge this because we just don't know what the financial settlement will be. I don't know if Tamara just wanted to comment on that. I can't imagine she has any more insights than anybody else, but into the Chancellor's mind, I'm sure she doesn't. But it might be worth just a comment or two from Tamara on that.
All right.
Sorry, Margaret, were you coming in there?
Well, David was asking you to come in.
So, so in terms of high needs, so particularly for the special schools, Ian, I know you're a governor of a special school. There's a further year of commitment to the high needs block. Up until now, that's largely funded additional demand across pupil numbers rather than seeing substantial increases in schools funding. In terms of the main schools funding allocations, there's a further year of commitment. Again, it's difficult to judge how that will play out in the per pupil unit changes. I think the DfE will need to fund the increases in deprivation that we're seeing, increases in free school meals, etc. So it's tricky to judge what an inflationary increase might be in that context because they will have a funding envelope that they'll need to operate within. I'm sure they're negotiating with Treasury around that. So there are ongoing conversations that we have, London councils and various kind of levels of lobbying with the ESFA and DfE on that.
Mia, your hand was next, I think.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to touch on the point which Tamara began to consider about the falling roles in mainly primary schools, and just whether there's any further information about how, what the support looks like for those schools who are going to be finding themselves in a very difficult position over the next few years due to quite a significant change in number on roll. I know you began to talk about it tomorrow. I just wondered if there was anything more specific.
Yeah, so I think given the level of falling roles in primary, it's probably worth a forum update, perhaps at the next forum. We work through quadrants. That's largely been focused on COVID up till now. So we'll be going out to quadrants over the course of this term to give heads updates on pupil numbers in their area. And we're working with head teachers on planned reductions and planned savings kind of in advance of that. In terms of the primary sector, it very much is creating an environment where parents have a lot of choice. And so you see falling roles particularly hitting certain schools and certain areas. And so that's a key factor that primaries are needing to manage. Over the course of the summer, the end of the summer term, beginning of autumn term, there'll be a schools funding consultation which will need to run locally. There is provision within the school funding regulations to have a falling roles fund. That is something that schools in Ealing have been reluctant to implement, largely because schools funding is lagged. So schools are protected for the best part of a year because their funding is based on the previous year's pupil numbers. So it gives some room for planned and phased reductions in expenditure. So that's something that we can kind of consider with head reps and then bring through the funding consultation to see if that's something that schools want to essentially provide for.
Thank you. I would just also point out that it does, of course, affect a number of head teacher colleagues presently who have got much lower roles than other schools, particularly in the north of the borough. And when these projections come through to secondary level, that is of course great concern about how that will affect probably certain schools. So I think it is something that if we could return to have a longer discussion on, that would be very helpful.
So I think it's absolutely something we can come back to in the summer meeting of the forum. So we'll provide an update at the forum for that, and we'll consider in the funding consultation. And I think the more detailed conversation is something that generally happens through high school heads and primary heads, smaller group meetings as well, because it, as you say, it affects particular areas in different ways and individual schools in different ways. So the quadrant meetings are kind of quite key to that, and we're keen to get back out to quadrants quite soon to start having those discussions.
Stefan.
Thank you, Margaret. It's following on in a similar vein to Maya's question. ARC Sloan is opening in September with sixth form, and I understand they've already got 150 enrolled. Ada Lovelace, that has been operating out of William Perkins for the last few years, is now in its own setting. And if we take those two factors combined with the falling roles in primary, what forward planning is there? Because this is going to hit secondary schools hard, really hard. And so we've got more secondary schools opening up and expanding as they go up to 11 until they go up to all forms of entry. And when they get to full entry, that's when the primary shrinkage wave is going to hit secondary schools, roughly speaking. So have we got any forward planning for this?
Yeah. So yes, Stefan, we do. I think something we need to bear in mind with high schools is we have a really a low rate of retention, essentially. So a large number of young people travel out of the borough for their high school provision. That's particularly an issue for Acton and Northolt areas. Our high schools are generally very popular, and people would come into the area if they could. We have really high standards and very popular schools and high school sector. Kim, I don't know if you want to come in briefly on, to cover some of the high school data, but I think it's important we come back to this conversation. Essentially, the key item on the agenda is to approve the scheme for financing schools. We can come back to the pupil number and school sustainability conversation in the summer. Kim.
Yeah, so I mean, as Tamara says, at secondary we are a net exporter. We're one of the sort of biggest net exporters in London, and so our retention is only around sort of 80% mark. So there's a lot of children who currently, and a lot of Ealing children who currently sort of put an Ealing High School as a first preference, don't end up getting the school that they want and ended up going outside of the borough. So it's not necessarily going to hit the drop in primary school isn't necessarily going to hit high schools at quite the same sort of magnitude because of that. Because if we continue to have, so the key thing will be to continue to for those schools to be popular and standards to be high. And so actually that what might happen is that retention decreases as the number of children coming through that retention increases as the number of children coming through the primary sector falls, rather than that you get this big drop off in secondary as you've seen in primary.
Anybody else? Right, is there anything else you want to tell us before we proceed to approve or not the scheme, Tamara or Kim? Right. Is there anybody who's against adopting the scheme as set out in Appendix 1 and 2 for this year? No.
Sorry, Margaret.
So, yeah.
Margaret, can I make a quick comment just before it proceeds around the equalities analysis, the impact assessment? I think that we might need to have just regard in one of the sections with regards to sex, someone being a man or a woman, particularly in regard to additional needs and the impact that any adjustment in funding will have. The issue is that there tends to be, and there's a lot of debate and research at the moment, and under identification of girls in the sector, particularly with regards to autism. And I think it might be worth putting something in the equalities impact assessment around that.
Anyone, any reaction to that, or is it something else we ought to consider later?
Well, it's part of the equalities impact assessment on the scheme.
Yeah.
So it goes hand in hand with adopting the scheme.
I could come in, Margaret, I agree with Paul on this, so that's something we can amend. Thank you.
Okay.
It's just
will you and Paul agree wording?
Yeah.
And we'll accept what you come up with.
It's just to really take note of it and the possible effect. So yeah, we could put something short in.
Right. Tamara.
Thanks, Margaret. Is it possible to for this forum to consider approving the scheme on the basis of the adjustment to the EAA that Paul suggested?
Yeah.
Fine by me, yeah.
I would be happy with that.
Thank you.
Is that all right with everybody? Can we approve the scheme? Thank you. I think all the recommendations are for noting, so I don't think there's anything else we have to do, is there?
No, I think we have Charles Bernard with us, Margaret, who is the Assistant Director responsible for SEND, and he was due to provide just an update to Forum around the SEND and inclusion strategy.
Right, would you like to do that, Charles?
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. So I will give you a quick overview, and then obviously happy to take any questions. So we have, I was asked to bring a SEND and inclusion strategy update today to this meeting. We have seen some very significant impacts of the pandemic for children and young people with SEND, particularly across mental health and communication and language. And you've heard that in the news recently, especially in relation to young children, but there is a system-wide issue in terms of impact. We have seen a rise in the number of children being put forward for an education, health and care plan, which is a statutory plan linked to need. And in Ealing, the most marked increase has been in the under 5 population. And there's a table on page 3 of the report which sets out by cohort the rises in numbers by age, and the biggest rises are that under 5 band and then 11 to 15. So with the rising in our identification, if this continues, we've currently, as of January, had nearly 3,000 plans. If it continued on, we would have 3,700 in 3 years' time. So strategically, we need to look at whether we, how we can respond earlier, and whether early intervention can reduce the number of children that actually go on to need a statutory plan. So I'll talk about that a bit more later in this report. So the key areas that the government wants us to focus on is around identifying children and young people with SEND responsively and early. How we assess and meet their needs is obviously critical, and how importantly we improve outcomes for them into adulthood. So in the context in Ealing has been really kind of challenging this year. We've already begun to talk about in this meeting around the fall in numbers in the primary sector. There's been a lot of thought about that, and there's an opportunity which I'll talk about later in terms of how we might use that space to meet this increase in demand around SEND, and how we might sort of innovate around using some of that space, especially in the primary sector. Our Ealing plan around the SEND strategy is due to end in March 2022, and will then be refreshed with a new plan coming into place. We've been talking to our parents and leads on the different priorities and reviewing that this year, leading into a refreshed plan. We just before the pandemic, in around January, February time last year, we got parents professionals together to review the current plan, and they broadly felt that the priority areas were correct. So supporting schools to reduce the variation in quality between different schools and build on the best practice was the priority one. Priority two is around clearer transitions, particularly in terms of preparation for adulthood and independence planning. And then priority three was the quality and timeliness of education, health and care plans process. And the final one was around the local offer, which is setting out how Ealing is going to meet the needs that is identified, and that's all services across schools, voluntary sector and health and social care. So they were the four priority areas, and they will stay in place until March, as I said, 22. We have reviewed those, and we will continue to review those over the summer, and that will lead into a new planning process, as I said. So some of the key kind of sort of things for the forum to sort of note and consider is that we've looked at our benchmarking data with other authorities. And so when we look at Ealing, proportionately we have fewer children on the SEN support level. That's the level of support before children go on to have a statutory education, health and care plan. And that's quite unusual, and actually that's a falling number. So in terms of identification of need, you'd expect more children to be identified earlier, and then a sort of a complexity up to a sort of triangle of need, if you like, with at the top of that, the few number of children with very complex needs. So that's kind of interesting and something we want to talk about with school colleagues and other partners a bit more. The feedback from parents is that there's some very good practice in our schools in Ealing, and we know that outcomes for SEND children academically in Ealing is a real strength, but there's also a challenge around consistency between schools, which is still there for parents. There's a challenge, as I said, around under fives, and that's become increasingly important with the pandemic impact. And the most highest level of need coming in this year is around communication, language development, and that's very, very significant at the moment. In terms of the proportion, this is raised by schools, so it was quite useful to bring this to the forum, that actually proportionately we have less children in mainstream with plans when we compare across to London and other and nationally. And we've got proportionately more children in specialist provision compared to other authorities as well. So again, that's something we need to reflect on around, level of need. But there is clearly in Ealing a sense that we have a rising complexity of cohort of children coming in, and there's been we commissioned a study into why that might be, and it seems to be quite a complicated set of circumstances that drives that complexity in Ealing. But one of the things that we found from that study, it's not necessarily children migrating into Ealing. That a lot of these children with complex needs are actually born or are living in Ealing before their needs become apparent. In terms of education, health and care plan bandings, again, there's an unusual pattern in the sense that we have higher numbers of children at the highest bands, D and E, and relatively lower numbers on the lower bands of need. So there's a challenge there around thinking about how we use that resourcing to improve outcomes as effectively as we can, and we can look at that together. And we've got the Send and Inclusion partnership within the ELP that leads on thinking about best practice and disseminating that across our school network through the Senko network. There's been a marked growth in specialist provision and arts, but as I said, there's an opportunity to look at some of those spaces that are opening up in our primary school sector, given this demand and pressure around specialist places. We might be looking at early intervention, nurture groups, and that's a sort of open kind of discussion that we will be consulting further on with schools. In terms of the equality issue, we see some significant disproportionality, especially around SEMH, and that links with the studies nationally, but there is particular issue in Ealing around Black Caribbean children and SEMH, which we need to kind of explore further, and how they are supported through early identification and how their needs are met later on in the system. So there is work to be done there. We have relatively low spend on outreach services and relatively high spend on specialist provision. And so reflecting on the balance between those two offers is something that we're beginning to do and will consult on further. And despite before I say that, we've improved the timeliness of education, health and care plans significantly, which has been welcomed, but there is more work to do around quality, and particularly around how we support families, children, young people in thinking about their growing independence and their adulthood within that the sort of support process. So more to do there in terms of quality and outcomes. And then finally, I'm going to hand over to Tamara, unless there are questions on this section. So in terms of the high needs deficit, we've seen across London some really high financial deficits opening up in some authorities. Ealing, it has got a relatively small deficit, and Tamara will take you through the figures in more detail. And we'll also set out the responsibilities of the school forum in relation to any deficit that we have. So I'm happy to take questions or to hand over to Tamara.
Well, Dave Woods wants to come in and has done for some time. Will you do that before Tamara speaks, Dave?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Charles. My question was about the large increase in the under 5 EHCP that you mentioned. I just wondered if you were aware or if there had been any work yet to identify, was there a particular reason or a particular need that was coming through with those pupils? Because we obviously have the nursery schools and the children's centres, which do a really good job of that early identification. And I just wondered, was there a trend that was starting to emerge in the particular need, or you may not know that as yet?
Yeah, thanks. And what we're seeing, it's the Mandeville cohort. So it's the very complex end of need that we're seeing an increase in, and need across the whole board. But you'd expect those Mandeville type children, the very complex children, to be, even with the pandemic context, they're attaining at very low levels. And so we're seeing a rise in complexity at that very high end initially. What the sector is reporting is that children, in terms of SEMH and language, there are very significant gaps in this cohort of children in terms of school readiness. So there's a lot of work to do. The increase has been so marked. I'd like to look at that further, and so I will be doing that, and I'm happy to come back on that as well in more detail.
Thank you.
Should we take you first tomorrow, or should we take the other questions first?
I think possibly take the other questions if that's
okay. Right, well, Jeremy, you're next.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Charles. The question that I've had, that I probably brought up before, whether it's in this group or in the other groups that we're a part of, is just about the data, the broad sweeping data that we get presented with, like compared to national, 5% higher, or this many more than that many. And I really wish we could have slightly more nuanced, granular data, because I mean, one could argue that yes, we have this many more plans, but the last I remember sitting in a heads briefing a couple of years ago, and Julie Lewis was talking about how Ealing had the highest performing schools in the country, or very, very close to it. So maybe actually us gasping at the fact we have more plans is unnecessary, because actually maybe those plans could be correlated to much better performance because they're getting better care. I mean, I just wish we had better data. And I know that it's a big job. And I know we've got wizards like Kim who do really incredible things with data, but I'm just wondering if in future, whether it's at this meeting or in a different forum, we can look at the data in a way that we can start to draw causality or correlation rather than just kind of compared to national. That's my first question or ask of you. The second bit was just about, in the report, it talks about the strategy itself being created by the SEND executive, which has representation from schools. And just in a really quick Google, I couldn't find any information on who sits on that committee or that executive, how one from a school may get onto that kind of committee to be involved in that strategic decision-making around all the points that you just made. So that would be helpful to know if it's appropriate in this forum or another.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeremy. There is masses of data, and I was going to point you straight to Kim, because there's a very detailed at school level, pupil level reports around SEND that are produced and I think are made available, particularly around attainment. There is an awful lot of other data, Jeremy, and I'm very happy to share that outside of the meeting. I recently pulled another report together which was around the prevalence of needs of plans, the numbers. We can do it by area. So there is a lot of data out there, and this is obviously the kind of higher level data that I've given today. But I'm very happy to supply more and work with Kim and her team to meet that data need for you. So that's the first point. Paul is on the SEND exec. And there is a constitution around that, and there is can't remember who else, Paul, off the top of my head, but there is a mainstream rep, so apologies if you're on the call. We will be refreshing the SEND exec, so there will be opportunities to join that group, and it sounds like you might be interested, Jeremy, which is great.
Paul.
Just to answer Jeremy's question, the mainstream reps mainly come from the SEND and Inclusion Committee, and so they're the mainstream representatives. Interesting what Jeremy says about data. Just a couple of things on that. The SEN audit has just been published on the EGFL, which does give a level of granular data. So that's worth looking at. So if you go into the EGFL, I think the SEN audit is being published for 2021, which would be helpful. And what I was going to say, Charles, actually was that what would be helpful was that there was a recent meeting with the forum members on high needs, and there was a presentation. I think it would be helpful if that was cascaded amongst all head teachers. I would love to say that the head teacher reps here would have the expertise to narrate that story, but I think it would be better coming from yourself, Charles, who has a more global view of it. But I think it would help, because quite a few head teachers are still not understanding, for very good reasons, the sort of complexity of the agenda around this. And it would be good if we could get into quadrants, and that presentation that we recently had was cascaded through the quadrants to as many heads as possible.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And when Jeremy came in on data, I thought some of those questions would probably be covered within that presentation. So yeah, I'm very happy to either be invited to quadrants or perhaps put that presentation on EGFL as well. So either or, both. Thank you, Paul.
Right.
Tomorrow, over to Ian, you want to come back?
Just a couple, if I may. Charles, you mentioned about the plans changing from 2022 because that's the end of the cycle of the current one. Do you expect there to be material changes coming out of that, or is it still too early to say? That was point one. The second was in terms of outreach. I mean, in terms of what we provide, for example, from Spring Hallow, that we're desperate to do more, but we're always constrained inevitably by budget. And I'm just wondering whether that's something that will be part of the plan to try to support mainstream schools and arts and so on, who perhaps need that support from a more specialist area. So that's something with a rather personal view. And the final, most personal of all, is that I can confirm that EHCPs do seem to be issued more quickly and more effectively, because my son is currently in that process, and I can say it's been the best I've witnessed so far over a number of years. So thank you for that. So those are my 3 points.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and I'm pleased your son has had a good experience. It's always good to hear. So in terms of material changes in 2022, we are going to refresh our strategic plan. It's too early, as I think Dave was saying, around need to kind of fully understand the impact of the pandemic. But certainly things like the mental health offer, SEMH, and speech and language will be really interesting in terms of how that plays out and how we meet those needs that are beginning to be seen. I totally agree with you around outreach. There's another section 3.3, which I'll go on to, or Julie will, around outreach. But that early intervention, how we can support schools in terms of meeting some of these needs, sort of low incidence needs that they come across in mainstream, is really important. And Spring Hallow's work has been effective in that. So yeah, thank you.
We now go to Tamara.
Thanks, Margaret. Thank you. So just as part of the SEND and inclusion strategy, obviously the high needs deficit is an important factor that we'll need to take into account as we're developing that plan. The local authority is in deficit. Our deficit, as Charles mentioned, is a lot lower than many other boroughs, and that kind of speaks to the close working relationship between the LA and schools and the good quality provision that we have and robust kind of financial planning. We will kind of need to have an internal deficit recovery plan. We are unlikely to need to present a deficit recovery plan to the DfE because we're likely to fall below the threshold for that. In terms of the responsibilities of School Forum in relation to SEN, clearly it's important that we consult with schools and we collaborate in the production of the SEN strategy. From a School Forum perspective, Forum consulted on particular elements around the kind of the funding mechanism, which is in the scheme, how we kind of determine the top-up aspects of that, and any changes to that approach. And the key decision for Forum, which will come later in the year, which is important. We work towards Forum feeling comfortable with the decision, whatever it is the transfer of the 0.5% funding from the schools block to the high needs block, and that decision takes place either in the November Forum meeting or in January, and there's a funding consultation that takes place before that. So that's just to kind of set out what the Schools Forum responsibilities are in relation to that. As referenced previously, there was a pre-meeting to this meeting which school head teacher representatives asked for, where we provided some more detailed insights into the SEND strategy. We'd be happy to put that in place as well in future to talk about some of the more detailed data aspects Generally speaking, that level of detail wouldn't come to a forum meeting and is managed through the SEND Inclusion Committee and the SEND Executive. So it would be to kind of agree with forum members how we take that kind of consultative approach forward in the summer.
Okay, are we ready to move on to the outreach report then?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to that tomorrow. I'm not sure if Julie was going to pick this one up.
Yeah, I'm
Yes,
happy to do that. Oh.
Thanks, Julie.
Evening, everyone. Yes, so the SEN Outreach Quality Framework came out of really a collective agreement that we needed to have stronger commissioning systems and a commissioning framework in place to really shape the future of outreach, given that it's designed to support children with SEND to remain in mainstream provision, and rather than be used as an assessment tool to gather information towards securing specialist placements. So the development of the framework is intended to support that high quality early intervention practice and that invest to save approach that's coming through the strategy that we will be talking with schools about in the summer term. So the outreach quality framework is now in draft form, and we're going to be circulating that to members of the committee and members of forum for comment. And as you would expect in any framework, there are clear expectations of the provider to liaise with the school in terms of outcomes, clear expectations of the receiving school and setting and what that looks like, clear expectations around models of delivery, individual, group and in terms of empowering staff and developing staff skills, and an accountability and reporting function back to the commissioning body, which in this case is the local authority because it's the high needs block, alongside clear qualitative and quantitative measures of success. So we've Madhu Bachu is leading on this work. She has consulted with a number of current providers, and so far this work has been really well received. So we're looking forward to getting that out and receiving your comments with a view to for it to be shaping commissioning really from this financial year onwards.
Can't see anyone's hand up. So can we accept both those reports?
Margaret, I think Jamie has, well, he had his hand up.
Did you?
Jamie Malloy, yeah.
Yes, if you don't mind. Julie, you were just saying that we're looking to commission, a different kind of response from the outreach services. And I imagine there will be increased costs to that. Are these outreach services, specifically SEMH outreach, going to receive any more funding in this academic year to enable the different approaches?
We haven't got down to the, in terms of sort of funding and costs attached to the provision. We haven't. We're not anticipating that there's more money. I think what we're anticipating is that we have a more robust way of assessing the value for money of the outreach work that is carried out. So there's sadly not going to be more money in the system. I think what we're looking to is making sure that the money that is in the system is being used in the best way possible, and recognizing that as the strategy rolls forward, we will potentially be looking at different kinds of outreach provision. I mean, Charles, you may want to add to this because you've been thinking about the funding model in terms of early intervention as well.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And sorry, the call dropped out a bit, Jamie, on your question, but it's around funding and outreach.
Funding.
Yeah, so as I said, relatively, Ealing spends relatively low on outreach compared to specialist provision. So that the funding model and the investor saving outreach is something that we're looking at. We haven't got any confirmed figures on that, but we are looking very carefully at it and whether that investment would really make a difference to the outcomes for children. So we haven't got a firm figure, but it's something we're looking at closely.
Thank you both.
Anyone else whose hand I haven't seen? Well, thank you very much for that comprehensive report, Charles, Julie, Mara. I take it that we accept the report and we'll look forward to hearing the further discussions. I think that concludes the main business of this evening. So all we've got to do is think about the next meeting, which the Chief Whip tells me is the 7th of July. So not a June meeting, but a July meeting, in fact. And it only remains, as it's the last meeting of the financial year, to say thank you very much to all the officers for the huge amount of work that you've been doing on our behalf and on the behalf of the children of the borough, especially in the incredibly difficult circumstances that you find yourselves in. I mean, thinking especially of Tamara and Kim and Judith and Charles and Julie, and I think not forgetting Gary, who wanted to leave us, poor thing, about a year ago, and has had to, well, has kindly volunteered to stay with us and support the authority through the problem. I don't suppose when he agreed to do it, he realised how long it would last, but we are very grateful to Gary, as to all of the officers. Thank you very much. The next meeting will be the first of the financial year, just the first of the council year, and we're supposed to elect a chair at that meeting. Well, a lot of us, me included, retire before the autumn meeting, and I'm certainly not coming back. So it may be that you might consider appointing a temporary chair for the July meeting, and then let the new membership, I expect most of you will still be on it, but the actual membership appointed for the next academic year, to let them appoint the chair in November. But that's up to you. Thank you very much. I think that's the end of the meeting. You can all go and have your dinner.
Thank you, Margaret.
Margaret.